I wanted to now start by introducing our speaker today, Professor Irfan Nuruddin, who is the Hamid bin Khalifa Professor of Indian Politics and the Faculty Chair of the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He also directs Georgetown's Indian Initiative, which is a university-wide initiative that advances research and teaching around India and its role in world affairs, and is a really robust and vibrant program. Those of you who follow him on Twitter know that they've got speakers coming through there all the time on India. Professor Nuruddin himself specializes in the study of comparative economic development and policymaking, democratization, democratic institutions, and international institutions. He has a long CV with numerous publications. We'll just highlight two. His first book was entitled Coalition Politics, Economic Development, Credibility, and the Strength of Weak Governments. And his newest book that he'll be talking about today is entitled Elections in Hard Times, Building Stronger Democracies in the 21st Century, both from Cambridge University Press. I think the most impressive line in his very impressive CV, though, is this. He received his PhD from the University of Michigan in 2003. So please join me in welcoming Professor Nuruddin.
Great. Well, thank you to all of you who have taken the time on this Tuesday afternoon to come to this talk. And even for those of you who will get extra credit for it, hopefully it'll be worth your while and that Professor Hicken won't regret the decision to offer you credit for coming to this lecture. It's a great honor to be back here in Ann Arbor. This is really the 7 happiest years of my life, I think, was spent over here. And for those of you, especially who are undergrads, I hope you'll let me establish my Michigan bona fides. As a couple of my students from Ohio State, where I taught for 11 years, will attest, I lived in Columbus, Ohio, I taught at Ohio State, and I wore my Michigan hoodie pretty much every day I taught for 11 years. The same hoodie at that. The inside of my wedding ring is inscribed Go Blue. Right, so that's how crazy this is. And I also want to thank Professor Craig Ramsey. Craig was a Michigan PhD as well and was my professor when I was an undergraduate at Ohio Wesleyan. So it's really lovely to see you again, Craig. Thanks for coming. I want to talk to you today about a book that I published last summer called Elections in Hard Times, Building Stronger Democracies in the 21st Century. Unlike most academic talks, I mean, most of us typically give talks about works in progress. This is really the first time I'm giving a talk about a book that's already published. In that sense, I've chosen to make the talk a little more general, a little more sort of what we did as opposed to how and why we made all the smaller choices that go into writing a book. But this is an ongoing research agenda, and so for my co-author and so we welcome all feedback, and we will take it very seriously. We'll incorporate it into the work we plan on doing. But what I'm going to present to you today is the finished product, and so understand it as such. All of the stuff I talk about today is written with that good-looking guy, Tom Flores, who's also a Michigan PhD, currently an associate professor at George Mason University. This is a project that was conceived initially, as I mentioned to some of you before, on the 6th floor of Haven Hall, I think around 2002, and then instantiated over the 15 years since then. But it's very much got Ann Arbor roots. I want to talk about this person. I don't know who she is, but in many ways she becomes a poster child for democratization in the 1990s. I could show you an infinite number of photographs like her, typically older, often female, often reflecting sort of democracy in unusual places, in new places. And what they all have in common is this pink and the purple finger, right? The ink-stained finger indicating that they'd voted. Throughout the 1990s and in the early 2000s, photographs like this were on the front pages of the Washington Post and of the New York Times, of The Economist, right, of Time magazine. And what they were all reflecting was this heady optimism that democracy had won, right? That democracy was here. And the way in which democracy was coming to all these new countries, these new places, was by the holding of elections, right? And this moment in which a country that had been under the control of dictators for decades before was now finally allowing people like her, who presumably had never imagined that they would be able to cast a vote to choose the leader of their country, right? Were finally being able to show to the world, I voted, right? Really very optimistic. Between sometime in the early 2000s, right? The late 90s maybe, we can argue about when to date it. But sometime between then and where we sit today, the mood palpably changes, right? And a few better examples than these two guys. So in 1989 and 1991, Francis Fukuyama publishes a book called The End of History. And the argument about the end of history is that effectively over many centuries, we had reached a moment where there was only one legitimate form of government any longer, and that was democracy, right? That Western liberal democracy and the institution of elections as the core of that democracy were no longer contested. No one had alternative arrangements that had any claim to legitimacy. Larry Diamond, right, 25 years later, right, publishes a book called Democracy in Decline, and this is a quote. "It's a difficult and messy time for democracy and freedom around the world. We have been in a global democratic recession for something like a decade." So let's do a little math, right? If we take Diamond at his word and say that we've been in a recession for about a decade, that puts us at about 2003, 2004. And Fukuyama in 89 is saying we've reached the end of history, right? Democracy is here. So at most, this glorious period of democratization of democracy lasts about 15 years, right? I will point out, and this is a bit snarky, but right, Diamond in 2014 publishes Democracy in Decline. In 1996, he and the same co-author published The Global Resurgence of Democracy, right? In 2036, they will say the return of democracy. Like good academics, they will have published the same argument on both sides and gotten lots of citations to the work. We are going to actually argue, what we show in the book is that Diamond's pessimism is not unwarranted, right? That in fact, the story about democratization over the last couple of decades has been one of a lot of defeats. And we want to understand why this is. So very simply, and I'll ask my professional colleagues to forgive the fact that I've got axes that don't have scales on them. So this is really just for pedagogical reasons. The blue line is what we might think of as our dependent variable. This is measured in any number of different ways. If you measure after you hold an election, right, some number of years out, has your democracy improved, whether measured by Polity, Freedom House, the unified democracy scores that are put out, what happens? And what we find is that over the decades, this changes, right? In fact, democratic elections are followed either by a decline in democracy or no change whatsoever, especially by the most recent decades. What's puzzling about this is that the quality of the elections that are being held all over the world have improved dramatically. We are holding better elections, higher quality elections than at any prior time in, I think, modern human history, right, in more places. And yet those elections are not resulting in better, deeper, higher quality democracies, right? Better elections, worse democracies. And what we want to try and figure out in this book and make an argument for is why. Let me sketch for you very briefly sort of the theoretical framework that we outline in this book, and then what I'm going to do for the bulk of the talk is show you the evidence that we marshaled in support of the argument, right? We can quibble about which pieces of that are stronger than others, and then I'll conclude with a quick discussion about what we see as the policy implications of this research. Okay, so here's the question, just to be very precise about it. What we want to understand is, why did elections lose their democratizing power at the dawn of this electoral boom, this period in which all over the world elections begin to be held, even as they become freer than they had ever been before? Here's the framework that we outline in the book and that we want you to think about. Much of the focus on democratization, and in particular the role of elections in the democratization, focus on the day of election, right, on the holding of that election. And we have generated an incredible amount of research, very high quality research, on what makes some elections better elections than others, right? So the literature on election observation, right, the practice that is now ubiquitous around the world, that we send observers to find out whether the elections met the best standards of holding elections around the world. We know a lot more than we used to about election forensics, much of that being done by colleagues here at the University of Michigan, about using existing data to know when leaders have tried to cheat in these elections. The election day is very good. But in the framework as we think about it, that is simply the starting point. That is where we start this entire analysis. And what most studies of democratization and elections miss is the in-between period between that first election and the next election. Because democracy is a system in which elections have to follow on each other as incumbents return to the public for a reaffirmation of the mandate that was given to them in the previous election. Without the second election, we don't have a democracy, right? The first election just gets us started. So we want to think about what happens in between. Well, let's assume we have an election, somebody wins this election. What do they come to power expecting? Well, we think about this in the context of legitimacy, and we try and define 3 different types of legitimacy that an incumbent inherits upon assuming power. The first of these is what we call contingent legitimacy, right? Meaning that by virtue of having won the election, you get some legitimacy because you are now the chosen person, the chosen representative of the people. Think of this as an election honeymoon, right? You won the election and you get the right to rule. People are going to give you some a honeymoon. We think of, in American politics, we refer to the first 100 days, right, in which politicians are typically historically thought to have a little more room to maneuver vis-a-vis their legislature, vis-a-vis their publics. We then define 2 other types of legitimacy, right? What we call performance legitimacy and democratic institutional legitimacy. Performance legitimacy is quite literally the legitimacy that you earn, that you add to the presidency, to the prime minister's office, by virtue of what you do once you're in office, right? So a president or prime minister that does well, that is popular, that is seen as legitimate, that is seen as being one of the great leaders of their country, returns to that office a legitimacy that subsequent leaders will in turn inherit. If you want to think of this as a stock and flow kind of argument about legitimacy, right? That any given leader coming to power inherits a certain stock of legitimacy, and then by virtue of what they do in office, adds to it, and that becomes a stock in the next election. The stock idea is then is really sort of captured by this idea of democratic institutional legitimacy, which is that regardless of who you are, when you come to power, you have the legitimacy that is granted to you by your office. And also by all the bureaucracy, all the institutions that exist that do the work of the state, even if you didn't do anything at all, right? So Mr. Trump comes to power, and regardless of what he does or not, a whole bunch of American bureaucratic institutions, federal government institutions, do their jobs, right? Social security checks get delivered, unemployment checks get delivered, healthcare, even if he doesn't particularly seem to like it, gets delivered, right? State Department officers are all over the world do their jobs. And all of that gives the presidency, a particular power, okay? So the way we want to think about it is 3 forms of legitimacy that leaders upon getting elected inherit. And of course, this varies tremendously across the world, right? In a country like the United States, a president comes to power and inherits, in a sense, almost 200 plus years of legitimacy as a result of that long-standing democratic tradition. They inherit the ability to do a lot of things through the state, a state that can provide public services all over this large country, right? And they inherit performance legitimacy, and then they also have the contingent legitimacy that comes from having just been elected. They then make all sorts of choices, right, once they're in power. And here's the core of the argument, that in most of the developing world, right, in most of the countries that entered the democratic world in the period of the electoral boom, leaders come to power, and the best they can hope for is that first form of legitimacy, the legitimacy that comes because they just got elected. But they're coming into power to run countries that have virtually no prior democratic history. They have very little by way of institutions that are able to perform, and their own capacity to enact public goods, right, to deliver public goods to their citizens is limited at best, right? They're running states, they're leading countries that don't have functioning public institutions to go out and deliver, right? That are bankrupt, that have tremendous legacies of conflict and of violence, right? And now they're told, run this country, and guess what? In 5 years, you got to run for re-election. The problem with politicians is that they want to get re-elected, right? I make a joke, right? But if you think about that fundamental premise, that in democracies, we ask politicians to get reelected. Means that what they have to do between elections is amass a record on which they can compete for re-election. You've got to go back to the people and say, here's what I did. Right? Here's why you should vote for me again. Democratic theory assumes that the record on which you're going to be running is a record of all sorts of good stuff. I built more schools, I built more roads, I built more hospitals, so many more people have jobs, so many fewer people are dying prematurely because they couldn't have basic health care. We've been at peace. Right? But what happens when the leaders who got elected are incapable of doing any of that? Not just because that they might be bad guys, they might be corrupt, etc., but because their states simply are not capable of delivering any of those kinds of things. Well, then they have to make other choices in order to get reelected. Right? We basically force them into a suboptimal set of governing choices from the perspective of democracy. I can't build a brand new education system because my education ministry is bankrupt, right? But I can build schools in villages that are populated by people from my kinship group, from my ethnicity. Right? Maybe I can't even do that. Then I'm going to intimidate my opposition. I'm going to control the media. I'm going to cheat, intimidate, harass, and if all of that fails, maybe even steal the election. The point of what we're trying to do in the book is really force ourselves out of a mode in which we began to think about the reason that some countries did well and some countries didn't do well as because they got lucky in terms of who their leaders were, right? This cannot simply be a story of America's a democracy, and a good one at that, because George Washington was a good guy, and Afghanistan is struggling to have a democracy function because Hamid Karzai is a bad guy, right? If it's just simply good guys and bad guys, then there's no room for thinking about this. It just becomes a luck of the draw. What we want to do is actually endogenize, if you would, why it is that some leaders make choices that are bad versus good from the perspective of democracy. And we want to think about sort of the conditions under which they are forced to govern. The counterfactual I'm going to ask you to think about, right, is if George Washington had been elected president of Afghanistan in 2003, right, how much better would he have done than Hamid Karzai? Right? Or maybe differently put, if Hamid Karzai had been president of the United States in 1789, would we remember him as a heroic figure as opposed to sort of the craven kleptocrat that I think he's now remembered as, right? I mean, so not the leaders, but the conditions. That's how we want to think about it. And all of this, of course, leading to democratic change. So tip of the iceberg, right? We're going to focus on elections really as the tip of the iceberg. But what I want to be thinking about then as we get into the evidence is to think about all the stuff that's below that iceberg. I'm going to spare all of you regression tables and all of that, and really, but you know, I'm a Michigan-trained PhD, so trust me that there's lots of regressions running around in the appendices of the book. But what I'm going to do is show you some pictures that I think will demonstrate the argument pretty well. Let me start by making a simple point, that better elections don't necessarily yield more democratic change. Right? This flies in the face of a lot of research being done by political scientists, most famously right now by Pippa Norris and colleagues in the Electoral Integrity Project, that really privileges having better elections on the day as crucial to democratic change. Tom and I value good, clean elections, right? So none of this is to say that we shouldn't worry about whether elections are clean or not. The point is, none of the evidence in the book supports the notion that having a clean election or a less clean election has any long-term effect on democratization. So very simply, this is, if we take all elections held anywhere in the world and divide them between low integrity elections, medium integrity, and very clean, good elections, and we think about how much democratic change did they experience after the election, right? The confidence intervals, those bands, overlap pretty completely. The one place where we find an effect that we report in the book is that if you look at the 1 year change in democracy, not this year to next year, you see a real bang for the buck of having a clean election. But if you extend that window out 2 years, let alone 5 years, it diminishes, it goes away. I think there are two interpretations for this that are worth thinking about for you guys, right? Young scholars thinking about this. One is that it's quite possible that this is simply a measurement artifact, right? You saw a clean election last year, you give the country a boost in its election score the next year, right? But maybe a more generous interpretation is that what a clean election does is give countries a small window in which if leaders then make better choices, a democracy might flourish. But that window closes very rapidly, right? And if they don't make good choices, any advantage of having a clean election in year one disappears pretty quickly. Okay, so what do we think is going on? What we do in the book is we identify 3 structural challenges that we think states are really burdened by in ways that they can't really escape unless we change how we do democracy promotion in the developing world. Okay, so I want to first give you the structural challenges, convince you that if there might be others, but at least that these 3 warrant our attention as to what's going on, and then I'll tell you how I think we might be able to do better. First, the country is holding elections in the electoral boom era, right? This period since the end of the Cold War, in which all those ink-stained fingers were being raised, compared to the older generation of election-holding countries, much younger. These are countries typically born in the era of decolonization in the 1960s and really the 1970s. They have very little by way of the prior democratic experience, right, even in the long past. And they have very little by way of continual democratic experience. So the red line over there, right, is the cumulative democratic experience in developed countries. Think of the advanced industrial European countries, the United States, Canada, Japan, etc. And what you see is that it's a steadily upward sloping line because every election adds to the stock that's being accumulated from the prior election. In the developing world, that's virtually a flat line. And that's because every election isn't necessarily followed by another election. Lots of stops and starts, right? Think of Pakistan, which in 70 years of independence has never once had a democratic transition from a democratically elected leader to another democratically elected leader. Not once in 70 years, right? Every election interrupted, then set back, right? This lack of democratic experience, we think, is a major constraint on that democratic institutional legitimacy that leaders are getting elected into, right? I've come to think of this almost as scar tissue, right? That you might have the next election, but the scar tissue, because and Jose Chaibub and others have argued this in the context of coups in Latin America, is that the memory of those coups, the fact that you had a coup once, makes you more susceptible to having coups later, simply by function of the fact that you've crossed that bridge once before, right? You're just more vulnerable to it than you were before. The bars over there are the number of coups experienced in the country. There are lots of countries in the world that have had more military coups than they've had successive democratic elections, right? But this is the context that you want to be thinking about these leaders getting elected into, running countries that have very little by way of prior democratic experience. So that's structural condition 1. Structural condition number 2, they're impoverished. What Tom and I do in the book is we define this concept called fiscal space. Think of this as the amount of money that leaders have at their disposal to spend on anything that they so desire, right? So governments come to power, and really what governments do, first and foremost, is they spend money on defense, on roads, on public universities, all sorts of things, right? Well, how much money do countries have at their disposal? That's actually a harder question to answer than you might think. The data are pretty spotty, but we did our best to collect as much data as we could. Here is, on average, across, if we divide countries into what we call the West, right? Again, advanced industrial, European, America, Canada, Latin America, Asia Pacific, and Sub-Saharan Africa, right? Just broad for the purposes of the graph. What we do over here is we plot tax revenues per capita, right? So per person tax revenues in real figures. Okay, so to our best ability, we use inflation, adjusted for inflation, adjusted for currency valuations, etc. So these are directly comparable to some extent. The thing I want to draw your attention to as you look at that graph is the y-axis over here, which does have a scale, right? It's a log scale, right? So the fact that the point is that each gap over there is not equal to the same amount of dollars, right? To go from here to here is to go from $20 to 100. To go from here is 1,000 to 10,000. Okay, so there are big differences. The red line is the advanced industrial democracies. On average, by 2005, the average OECD country had roughly $8,000 per person in tax revenues to spend. This is the developing world. Sub-Saharan Africa. On average, by 2005, the average developing country had $99 per person to spend in tax revenues. Right? We can, again, I'm willing to put confidence intervals around those numbers. They're not coming close to each other. Right? So we've got some leaders coming to power with $8,000 per person that lives in their country available to spend, and we have others coming to power with about $100 available to spend. Sierra Leone is a classic example of this that I like to use. Right? Sierra Leone has this massive civil war, ugly civil war. Prior to the civil war, it had a per capita tax revenue base of in the low thousands. Once the civil war starts, the economy collapses. In the post-Civil War era, Sierra Leone's per capita tax revenue is under $1.50 per person. Okay? And so the question really that we want to push you on and to think about, anyone who reads this book to think about, is what kinds of governing choices, pro-democratic choices, do we think leaders elected when they have $2 to spend per person living in their country are likely to make? Okay, final piece of this particular house. Elections are increasingly held in conflictual societies. This is something that has been largely ignored by the democratization literature, we would argue, right? But the simple descriptive fact is that elections increasingly are held in places where there is either an ongoing conflict within the country or that are recently recovered from the conflict. If we define conflictual elections, we define conflictual elections as those elections held in a country with a civil war going on somewhere in the country, or that is within 10 years of having had a civil war. By the 1990s, right, some 40%, almost half of all elections held in the developing world were in a conflictual society. The blue line over there is founding elections, first elections, right? The election that is going to be the first democratic election in a country. Almost 60% of founding elections in the developing world were in conflictual societies. Right? So put all of that together, and what I've tried to show you, what we try to show you here, and it's all backed up by sort of regressions, is that the elections held in the developing world, just at a descriptive level, were being held in countries with very little democratic institutional capacity, with virtually no fiscal resources for governments to spend money on, and in conflict-ridden societies. If we go back to the theoretical framework, the way we think about this is that these are exactly the societies in which leaders should be very hard-pressed to make big, pro-public good kinds of policy decisions. Right? They're going to build schools for everybody. They don't have the resources to do that. Right? So what they do is that they resort to patronage, to club goods and private goods that they provide to their kinship communities, right? Where they use conflict, etc. And we show through a series of models that we estimate in the book that countries with lower fiscal space, countries with lower democratic experience, countries with more conflict history have lower quality elections, have elections in which they're more likely to use harassment or intimidation in subsequent elections, result in smaller democratic change, etc., more susceptible to coups. We also use CSCS data. Again, thank you to the University of Michigan for those data. We use CSCS data to show that citizens living in countries with more fiscal space, democratic experience, and less conflict, on average, have greater proportions of the population saying that they're satisfied with how democracy works in their country. Right? So both at the micro and at the macro level, these three factors seem to be pretty robust at predicting worse outcomes for democracy. Okay, so just to wrap up that part and before we talk about sort of what comes next. Two conclusions of sort of the research. The democratic recession, and we want to be a bit provocative here, is a direct consequence of the electoral boom, right? What happens in the electoral boom, which is a period that we define as starting at roughly 1988, basically the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, is that lots of countries enter the system to hold elections for the first time that are really bereft of the structural conditions that we think are associated with successful democratization. You have all these countries recovering from civil wars, right? Civil wars start ending at a very rapid rate in the 1990s as the Soviet Union collapses and can no longer sponsor one side of the civil wars. Civil wars end. The Western system, Boutros Ghali and others at the United Nations espouse what they call the agenda for peace, where they say the civil wars ended, let's start rebuilding the state, hold an election. A lot of these countries are in massive fiscal crisis. The IMF is in there saying, cut your budgets, cut spending, cut taxes, etc. It's a perfect storm, right, of young countries holding elections without any of the conditions that we would hope that they would have access to in order to succeed. So what happens? And what can we do now? In many ways, this is a pessimistic argument, and we have tried to sort of come to terms with that, right? It's very tempting. I live in Washington, D.C., right? I've had the opportunity to present this book to the folks doing democracy promotion work at the State Department, at the USAID, even at the World Bank. And it's very tempting to want to come and say, here's what we should do and everything's going to be better, right? And I want to try and resist that temptation with you as well, because part of what the argument is that we cannot substitute for decades of very boring, small, everyday kinds of institution building with quick fix solutions. There are no quick fix solutions. So we're sort of advising in ways that are completely politically infeasible to the folks who have to worry about this on a daily basis, right? We're advising a long perspective as opposed to, here's what you do in this budget or not. But we still want to think about it. We're going to focus on two sets of recommendations over here. The first is we need to rethink what we do and how we do aid for elections. The United States government, for instance, gives lots of election aid to countries. This is typically to fund things like election observers, better, electronic voting machines, all sorts of things. What we find in the book, and this is in the final chapter of the book, where we assess a set of commonly used democracy promotion practices, is that the way in which these are targeted might not be optimal. So for instance, the good news about democracy aid, DG aid, is that it really helps in countries with very little democratic experience. That is as we should imagine, right? These are exactly the places where boosting their resources with democracy aid should be good. The bad news is that there's very little of this given, and it's only given in election years. So let me just show you this. So this is just on average the difference between election years and non-election years, but let me give you an even more evocative example. This is Liberia, right, which is one of the US government's largest recipients of democracy and governance aid. The red line is the amount of aid given, right, and this horizontal line over here is the median amount of aid. And then we have marked the 1997 election and the 2005 election. Democracy governance aid given by the US government is to support things like political parties, right, to train politicians about how to be politicians, to teach young legislators. All this money is given at the time of election. And you can see the first spike in 97, and then you can see the huge spike in 2005, and then the collapse again, and then it ramps back up in anticipation of the 2011 election, and then back down again, right? If anything, either we just smooth that out, or we focus the money in between these elections, as opposed to only at election time. But what citizen activists and a lot of developing democracies point to is something that we have known in other domains as well, which is that democracy aid has its own version of aid amnesia, right? We focus on the election and then we move on to the next election, as opposed to sustained engagement with a given country. Similarly, aid threats, right? There's a lot of threats made by the US government or by other major democracy aid donors to say that if you don't have a good election, we'll cut your aid off. Again, we find that aid threats can help in countries with little democratic experience, right? But the bad news is that we don't use them against countries that with very little democratic experience. If anything, what the US government does is, and I keep saying US government, but this is true even of the European governments, is that in the worst elections, in the countries holding the worst elections and the countries holding their first elections, we tend to give them a free pass and say, this is your first election, you're just learning the ropes, don't worry about it. And we focus our attention on these medium integrity elections. Countries that have been doing a bunch of elections, they do it okay, but there's a lot of weaknesses, but not on the worst offenders, right? I've talked a bunch to people who do election observation for a living, and their justification of this is they have adopted a policy of that if we're not at the table, we're going to get locked out. And if we go about condemning the worst elections right away, all that's going to do is get us kicked out of the country, and we're never going to have access again. And so this is this real tension between access and being able to push. Okay, let me talk about the other recommendation and then wrap this up. The other thing I want to, that we think there's a real opportunity on, even if the political climate isn't hospitable right now, is that we need to figure out a way to buffer states' fiscal space, right? Tom and I are both political economists in how we think about the world, and so this might not be surprising to those of you who know us. But we think that the evidence is pretty striking that, in fact, we need to give more aid and we need to find ways to help states raise taxes if they're going to succeed. Again, the yellow bars over there, do you like the choice of colors, right? That's the maize and blue, right? So the yellow bar is taxes, tax revenues per capita. This is average over the entire period, which is why the y-axis is different. The blue bars are foreign aid, official development assistance given to those countries on average, right? All of this in per capita figures. And you can see the thickness of this blue bar for sub-Saharan Africa, which is by far the largest recipient of ODA. Even with all of that ODA added, if the US government, the richest government in the history of the world, right, struggles to be able to afford healthcare for its citizens, quality public education for its citizens, etc., what is the hope over here, right? There's this interview of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf in Liberia, right, when she was first elected, and for those of you who follow African politics or Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, you know that she was very much seen as one of the poster children for sort of the new face of Africa, right? And she has this interview with, I think, in The Economist, and they're asking her what her plans are for the country, and she said, my finance minister has to walk up 5 flights of stairs because the elevator in the finance ministry doesn't work, right? One of my colleagues at Georgetown is a guy named Steve Radlett, who was one of her early advisors in 2005, and none of the offices in the Prime Minister's office even had air conditioning, right? In settings like that, it is very, very hard to imagine that what leaders are going to do on average is make the kinds of choices that would support democracy writ large. It is much more likely that what they're going to do is make suboptimal choices that divert resources either to corruption or to patronage or clientelism in ways that undermine democracy. What's interesting over here is that this is one place where I think we could actually make some progress, but where institutional bureaucracies come in the way. The Central African Republic has had an election that has now been postponed several times, right? Last year, the USAID was charged with running the elections, helping run the elections in CAR. At the same time that they were preparing to mount a mission, the World Bank and the Department of Treasury of the US government and the IMF had a major conference on aid on basically how to fix the Central African Republic's economy, to which no USAID person was invited, right? I was talking to one of the USAID people, and they said that they found out about this about the summit via Twitter, right? So if you're going to be helping a country like Central African Republic, we simply have to have the elections people talk to the economy people as we move forward. Okay, just to wrap all of this up. What we've tried to do in the book, available on Amazon and all your favorite bookstores, right, is make an argument that we want to rethink democratization and the prospects of democracy in ways that take seriously the structural conditions under which leaders have to come to power. A lot of the focus, and I realize many of you are in a class on elections and election reform, has correctly been on elections, right? We have to get that first piece right, and I think we've made tremendous progress in that regard. But what we run the danger of is ignoring the fact that once these guys come to power, they have to govern for 5 years in ways that set the tone for the next election and every election after that. And we got to sort of empower political parties, we got to build institutions, we got to do a lot of small work that currently is not being done. And in ways that I think set the tone for where we are today, where all over the world elections are held only to see democratic backsliding, democratic collapse, from Hungary in the heart of the European Union to Turkey to the Philippines and beyond. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
The floor is open. We ask that you speak in the mic so we can pick it up on the recording, but we're going to let you field your own questions.
Very good. Anyone? Thanks, Brian.
Thank you, Irfan. That was very provocative, and I find much of the argument super compelling. My question is kind of motivated by many of the comparisons you made, contrasting developing countries against the West. And I wonder whether that really is the fair comparison. When you're, even that last graph you showed of tax revenues for citizens, I wonder, is it really the West that is the comparison? Is that the hypothetical? Is that the counterfactual? It is true that doing democracy is really difficult in these poor developing contexts where there is not that fiscal space. But for a citizen, are you comparing this to what is happening in Western Europe and in North America? Or are you comparing it to your neighbors who might not have democracy and similarly constrained by issues of fiscal space? So I just wonder if we threw a different lens at it, where we're not contrasting the challenges of the developing world against the industrialized world, but within the developing country context, comparing it to non-democratic neighbors, do you still have the same sense of kind of, I'd say, pessimism about the challenges of democracy, or do citizens actually say it's tough, but it's still better than the alternative?
Yeah, so I think that's a really fair question from the perspective of citizens. Let me answer the question in, I have two responses. The first is, let's not talk about citizens, let's talk about their leaders, right? And so in some sense, your question pushes us on the question of, is there an absolute threshold beyond which we would want to say, if a state has less than that, kind of a Jaworski et al. Sort of, $5,000 per capita, below that democracies don't flourish, above that they do, or they've managed to consolidate. Is there a version of that for tax revenues, that if a state doesn't have a certain floor of tax revenues per capita, it has a very hard time consolidating democracy, because you can't do the work of the state, right? It simply cannot provide at scale for the citizens the night lights and all sorts of other things, the electrification that is required in order for the state, for citizens to see in the state a provider of public services to which it has a relationship and can then rely on. So I think of this as a sort of a modern version of the no taxation without representation kind of argument, but the flip of it, no representation without taxation, right? In systems in which there are very little tax revenues being drawn from the public, you run the danger of the state being divorced from the citizens that allow the state to sort of have a lot more leeway. So I would push you back and say, if you think of it from the leader's perspective, whether or not I have more money, whether or not Bhutan has more money than Nepal might be irrelevant if neither of them has enough money to actually do the function of the state. But now let's flip the other question. I don't know what the right comparisons that citizens make, but I do think this is changing in real time because of the advent of technology and media that beams into every village in India, that has every slum in Bombay has cable antennas, and they very much are seeing images that are reflecting what a standard of living is, not in their neighbors, but in the West. One of my PhD students at Ohio State, who's now back in Korea, wrote this fascinating dissertation looking at out migrants from the Philippines, right, which is a major, as you know, migrant sending country, economic migrant sending country, and to all over to different parts of the world. And what she found was that when they come back, if they went to Dubai or the UAE or whatever, they actually come back with worse democratic attitudes than better, right? Because really that is the comparison. They're like, man, things work pretty well over there, and to hell with democracy, it doesn't seem to be a whole lot of function. So I do think, I take that piece of evidence, I take sort of a more general sort of wonderment about what happens when the poorest of the poor are still watching, TV shows reflecting a standard of living abroad when they're hearing those stories on a regular basis, and how that changes where the benchmarks are. In 1950s India, my guess is you're right, that the comparisons might have been more local and more constrained. I'm not sure that's true of 2017 anywhere. But I think it's a fair question. I think that question about whether what we are implying over here is a relative comparison or an absolute one, right? I mean, that there's an absolute level of below which states have a very hard time performing the functions of the state to build what I called early on performance legitimacy, right? And that's really where we should be focusing our attention. So that's a good point. I should think about that. Ma'am?
I've been working on a book with a Venezuelan co-author on the changes that have taken place in Venezuela recently. And I find everything that you had to say very interesting, because I think that Venezuela is a very different case in that there really is 40 years of democratic experience and many elections and so on and so forth, a couple of little coups, but not very big. Louder, okay. And then when Chavez comes to power, he has a lot of what you called, I think, fiscal space because of the oil revenues in Venezuela, a long tradition of democratic electoral governments, and his own vision of what he wanted to create, the socialism of the 21st century, but with a lot of money to create it so that he really could, build apartment buildings for the poor, bring Cuban doctors from Cuba to take care of the health care of the poor and so on. And then when he dies, he's succeeded by Maduro, Nicolás Maduro, who has nowhere near the charisma that he had, but also the oil revenues, become half of what they used to be, so that there isn't the fiscal space. Anyway, I wonder if you could comment a little bit if it's a case for you guys.
I'm limited by not being an expert in any way of Venezuela or even of Latin American politics, but I think it's a very instructive case. So one of our friends and professional colleagues, a guy named Pat Dunning, who teaches at Berkeley, right, his first book was called Crude Democracy, in which Venezuela is the main case study in that book, actually arguing contra the broad resource curse literature about how oil is bad for democracy, that Venezuela was a case in which the oil revenues had actually made democracy possible, right? Because of exactly the argument that we outline over here, all the spending to provide public goods and build sort of the legitimacy of the state. I think I don't have a good answer for how to think about Venezuela fully in the context of the argument. I do think that the resource curse literature gives us one angle in that, which is that oil revenues are fundamentally different from tax revenues. They might be used by states for good things to provide public goods, but because they come not by taxation of the citizens, there is a fundamental breaking of the citizen elite connection, right? So it undermines accountability, it undermines certain forms of representation. So I wonder whether really what we're seeing in the context of Venezuela, of course, is the dangers of it being all oil-based revenues, right? That it undermines the state's incentives to go out and create a tax base to do all the other things to build institutions, because you're being subsidized from the top because of the oil revenues. But when the oil prices crash, right, the bottom comes out from underneath. Yeah, but it's a fascinating case and tragic one at that. So thank you for your question. Sir?
Thank you, Irfan. This was a fascinating talk, especially the point about looking at the 5 years rather than just the snapshots. So I've been thinking about it. I was actually curious about what is the normative status of the concept of legitimacy across the three. And I was in particular thinking about, two states in India rather than two countries. If we were to compare, say, Gujarat 2003 to 2015 and Bihar at the same time. I mean, Gujarat, rich state, industrial state. We get the current prime minister then, and he orchestrates or at least he abets a riot, demonizes the community, and wins the elections and becomes maybe even more legitimate. And then Bihar, which has had much more caste-based conflict than, say, Gujarat, you get and lower tax base, less industrialization, and you get a chief minister who's able to do some certain public works, yes, graft and all that too, but then perhaps, so anyway, I was curious, I mean, how legitimate is legitimacy?
I want to say maaf karo. I think that's a good question. And look, the problem with the language of legitimacy, or at least used by a non-political theorist, right? I'm offending, I'm sure, all my theorist colleagues, is that I use it broadly, right? What I mean by legitimacy is that there's what you're trying to do, and Modi, at the end of the day, and I share your discomfiture with him and his politics and his history, is a good example of somebody who at least every 5 years returned to the polls and had to be re-elected. So 3 times chief minister of the state, and then now prime minister. Whereas Bihar, for all that we might prefer about Nitish Kumar and even Lalu Prasad Yadav and the politics they represent, right, because of that limited capacity, have a lot more questions raised about graft and corruption and all sorts of other things. So I think the state level comparison, especially as someone who studies Indian state politics as one part of my research interests, has not been beyond what I've been thinking. In fact, the fiscal space argument really was born in a 2008 comparative political studies paper I wrote with Pradeep Chibber, who was once upon a time a professor here in Ann Arbor as well. And what Pradeep and I show is that Indian states with limited fiscal space have much higher rates of anti-incumbency and electoral volatility, right? And so the fiscal space idea that we brought into the book actually came out of the study of the Indian states, that where you have, so Modi's Gujarat, because of that revenue and all of that, is actually able to reinvest in, maybe to exclude Muslims and others and lower caste minorities, but nonetheless to provide public goods that builds a loyal following for the BJP, that allows them to win elections. Whereas in other states where they can't do that, where they have to give out freebies at election time, etc., you don't build those stable bases, and then you have the roiling of the anti-incumbency and electoral volatility. So I would say that the state level in India, I think, is consistent with the broader argument, even as it raises questions. And your question about Chavez is a good example, that none of this is to suggest that having performance legitimacy is necessarily normatively good, right? You might use that legitimacy for all sorts of other ends, but we're taking on average that it might be good for the institutions, etc. Yeah. So.
Thank you very much for coming. I was wondering what you think the incentives are that a leader has once elected to actually seek out that functional or performance legitimacy when they already have state power. They have all of these kind of tools in their toolkit to, whether that you spoke about that they could use. Yeah. What incentives do they have to actually build up those other kinds of legitimacy?
Yeah, that's a nice question. I think maybe 2 responses over there. One is from a purely political economy perspective, being able to win elections by the provision of public goods and state capacity is much more efficient than retail gang violence, if you would, right? So it would much better if people sort of feel a fealty and a loyalty to the state, as opposed to having to use intimidation to go after them. So this is very classically Mansoor Olson's argument about stationary versus predatory bandits, right? Stationary bandits set up, they establish some legitimacy, and they benefit from the exercise of that power because they don't have to expend on repression. But where you have to repress in order to get it back, it's much more expensive, much more dangerous. So I think that's one. There is an argument, and I'm less sympathetic to this one, but a lot of people have made, that there are international benefits to being seen and perceived as a legitimate Democrat in the system today, right? So Susan Hyde in particular has argued, and others have followed, that states that are seen as being good Democrats receive more international aid, they get goodies out of the international system, and that you'd much rather be seen as being somebody who's committed to democracy than somebody who's antagonistic to it. So we laud those leaders of the democratic world who abide by negative electoral decisions, and we condemn those who reject the will of the populace, sort of thing. I have to say that as persuasive as that argument is, the evidence on that is very limited. right? It's actually very unclear that any serious economic consequences occur to countries that don't do this. Egypt, Morsi to Sisi, there's a little slap on the wrist, but most of the money keeps flowing and all of that sort of stuff. So I think it's actually more that Olsonian argument at the domestic level, that at the end of the day, if you can have the state function pretty well, you benefit from it. Whereas having to go out and sort of knock heads in order to win the next election is just harder to do. So it's fair. Craig.
Good to see you again. You said conflict surrounding the attempt to democratize and hold elections is obviously an issue we've seen in a lot of places. But does the nature of the conflict really matter quite a bit? That is, if it's, how we say, economic or religious or ethnic, etc., if you see any evidence that it matters, not only the intensity of the conflict, but what's the source of it?
Yeah, that's a great question. In chapter 7 of the book, we separate different types of conflict on the basis of what they were being fought over. And the stylized fact that comes out of that analysis is that secessionist conflicts that have an ethnic basis are the worst for democratization. Conflicts that are fought over what we call the control of government, right? And so the classic example over here might be Cuba, right? And Fidel sort of marching on Havana to take over the state. In those places, conflicts tend to be shorter, quicker, and decisive, right? And so one side wins, and then they set up the state, and they might have some growing pains, but they have a chance of doing that. Conflicts that are out in some remote part of the country where there's an ethnic minority enclave fighting, where the conflict persists for a long time, is really corrosive over the long run to democracy. So we do find, in ways that are quite consistent with, I think, other expectations, that ethnic secessionist conflicts are the worst for democracy. In other research that preceded this book, that focused more explicitly on post-conflict democratization, that was published in articles, we also show that negotiated settlements are not particularly good for democracy, really. And it's a sort of an interesting other question, that the international community has heavily emphasized negotiated peace agreements to end civil wars, because we don't want people killing each other. But decisive military victories of one side or the other are a lot better in the long run for post-conflict reconstruction, right? Because there's an end to the conflict. So, but it comes really at tension with the humanitarian intervention impulses that are now dominant around the world. Alan, did you want to get in queue? Or Margaret?
Thanks. So, as I understand it from your discussion of the graphs, your recommendation is to use aid to support improving fiscal capacity and state capacity overall. But I'm wondering how you would then respond to the literature that equates increased foreign aid with a kind of resource curse, and how that would be avoided in these circumstances, because there's been a long-running push for improving things like aid for improving rule of law and improving state capacity in a lot of these developing countries, and often that aid gets diverted for exactly the same sources of corruption that you're raising as an issue for democratic legitimacy.
Yeah, a lot wrapped up in that question, so let me try and pass it out a bit. Firstly, I think when I say put more money in to allow states to do more, I mean it, right? So I'm actually, and I'm not going to speak for Tom on this, because this is beyond the scope of the book, but I actually think that what we want to do is not worry so much about how much money is getting wasted or not used. We want to actually put more money in the hands of leaders in order to do the work of the state, right? That what we have a lot of, what happens a lot is a diversion by donors into the hands of civil society, NGOs, etc., because we think that the money will be used more efficiently by them. It probably will, but in ways that might have very perverse long-term consequences for democratization. if in fact we're not building through the state, we're building outside the state, where citizens come to associate all the good things that happen with the NGOs and all the bad things that happen with their state governments. That doesn't seem like a good recipe for building strong, stable states in the long run. I also don't think that it's impossible to imagine writing a contract, right, that puts more conditionality and reporting and accountability on how the money gets spent, right? So on the one hand, it is true that money gets diverted, but it should be feasible in these very sophisticated times we live in to basically say money should be going, if it's going to rule of law, here's what we have to see, here's the accountability that's occurring. So it doesn't feel to me like that has to be a major obstacle, even while we recognize that it's an obstacle. So I think the main question, I think it's a really fair one, is Kevin Morrison wrote a very nice article some years ago in I.O. that thought about aid as what he calls non-tax revenue, and sort of made the argument that aid and oil are separate but different, but both non-tax revenues, and so should be subject to the same resource curse. I think all the evidence I've seen about the resource curse effects of aid focus on the economic effects of aid. I don't know that I've seen any persuasive evidence that links it to negative effects on democratization, right? So I want to just distinguish between a resource curse that may apply to the economy, even as separate from a resource curse that applies to democracy, right? Whereas Michael Ross's earlier paper on does oil hinder democracy is a paper linking oil to democratization directly, right? I've not seen an equivalent on aid on that. So I want to just raise as a question mark whether or not we actually know that aid's resource curse applies to democratization writ large. It might not. It might be that aid is okay for democracy, even as it screws the rest of the economy or hurts the rest of the economy, for instance. But here's the other thing. I just don't think, based on all the numbers that we have seen, that most countries are at any risk of getting so much aid as to distort the domestic economy. We actually give very little aid to most of the developing world, right? Not just the United States, but most countries, most donor countries. The amount of aid flowing into these countries, given the size of the populations, given the needs, is actually still a small fraction of most countries' budgets. There are some exceptions to that, but the average developing country could, I think, absorb a lot more aid than is being received. But even if we leave aid aside, maybe think about this as an argument for how do we catalyze private investment? How do we catalyze different kinds of capital flows? How do we think about the structure of World Bank and IMF programs that deliver money to them so that it might not just be aid, but it could have conditionality wrapped in, etc. So anyway, I don't mean to be defensive on this particular point, but I think that we need a new way of thinking about aid that escapes sort of both the pessimism that says all the aid is stolen, right, and that all of it is sort of wasted, to basically say, you know, how would we do that better? Because what we have is a fundamental issue of lots of developing countries with very little money for the states to spend, tax revenues that are very limited in their potential sources. You have large parts of these countries that are not part of the formal economy. You can't tax them really. They're very poor people. Income taxes are just not going to yield a whole lot. And then they're asked to compete in an international political economy in which high corporate taxes are going to be a disincentive to investments, in which high tariffs, which are the primary source of revenues for most developing countries, are increasingly being cut in order to comply with international trade agreements, right? My colleague Neeta Rudra at Georgetown is writing a book right now that Cambridge is going to be publishing next year that sort of talks about tax revenues writ large. What happens under the Washington Consensus of international economic liberalization is we simply cut the legs out from under most developing countries where their tax revenues are concerned, right? We told them to cut their corporate taxes to be competitive. We told them cut your trade protections in order to be open. But those are the two main sources of money that developing countries had. And we didn't substitute that with a whole bunch of income taxes and all of that, right? So we do have some sales taxes which are regressive. You know the whole gamut. So I don't know what the right answer is, Margaret. I think it's a really huge question. And I'd love to see more sustained attention at sort of the political economy of public finances in the developing world and linking that to this political accountability, democratization part of the puzzle. So not just PE of public finance for its own sake, but thinking about the political behavioral ramifications of that. I think it's a huge agenda to be written on.
So I'm very sympathetic to the argument, but just want to push you on, I guess, a couple related ways. So one of the alleged virtues of holding elections in a post-conflict situation, and you present some evidence that these may be alleged rather than realized, is that you invite all sort of parties to the conflict to buy in, to feel like they have a seat at the table, to participate in a post-electoral solution or post-conflict solution. And you're arguing for sort of time, right? We need time to build these institutions. We need time to build fiscal capacity before we expect elections to have the kinds of effects that we want them to have. So my question is, I guess, is who's the caretaker in the interim, right? Whose institutions aren't neutral? They can be used for good or ill, as you said. And if who's the entity doing the institution building in that interim, and do we run the risk of those institutions not building up the capital and capacity and legitimacy you hope they're building if they're being seen to, in the service of one party or the other, one group or the other?
Yeah, I think we talked a little bit about this over lunch, as you recall, and I think it is a really fundamental question, the chicken or egg, of how do we build a democratic state without an election, given that elections are the entry point into this. Let me suggest, before I try and answer that, a different reason for which I think all these elections have been held in post-conflict societies. And I think the reason is that the West, and by this I really mean the United States in particular, has been very worried about being labeled as neo-colonialist occupying forces, right, in these conflicts. And given that most interveners in civil wars, Western interveners in civil wars, typically were ex-colonial partners, right? This was also the case in those conflicts as well. The French didn't want to be portrayed as, coming back to colonize neither the British nor anyone else. And so what the election serves is as a focal point, right? Now that the elections, here, you guys have chosen them, and we are going to assist, we are going to support. But take Iraq and Afghanistan, right? In both Iraq and Afghanistan, elections were held within 2 years or so of the conflict ending, of the war ending. But the United States has troops, personnel, and lots of money flowing to both of those places. It is not, in fact, the case that what those elections did was allow the US to leave, right? The US is still there. It's still trying to build those institutions. It is just now with an elected partner in place. So what our argument would be, and what we know at least from the Iraq case and the Afghanistan case, is for many US efforts, they were feeling undermined by the elected politicians of the home country, whether al-Maliki or Karzai or whatever. So I think the counterfactual question is not sort of, that we have to have a different caretaker. It is whether or not the domestic organization that is entrusted with being the local partners in the reconstruction efforts have to be the result of a national election, as opposed to grand coalitions, power sharing agreements, and other forms that are not alien to how political scientists have thought about divided societies before. It also is striking that I think we've got actual evidence, and you know much more about these than I do, but my sense is that we took a lot more time in certain in Southeast Asia and different forms than we have in most African post-conflict societies, where we have moved much more to the let's hold the election quickly and we're out of here, right? So I'm definitely guilty of painting with a very broad brush over here, right? But I think in those regional variations of how we've attempted a lot of this, there are lessons to be learned. And maybe I will confess to being guilty of, I think the place where I think we've done the most damage has been in sub-Saharan Africa, right, over the last 20 years, where a lot of these countries emerged from really devastating civil wars with virtually no economic base. And we elected leaders and then was kind of surprised when, guess what, things didn't work out the way we hoped for. So yeah.
Thanks. So following up on Margaret's question, your answer to it, I'm wondering, it makes sense to me, your argument about how expanding the fiscal base of a country that's recently transitioned to democracy would improve the incentives for citizen accountability and better governance and more public service delivery and those sorts of things. But I wonder, in the cases of competitive or electoral authoritarian regimes, of which a huge percentage of countries that at least nominally transitioned to democracy in the 90s and are still developing countries are, in those cases, do you think it makes sense if they either through their own economic policies succeed in expanding their tax revenue, or through foreign assistance, do you think the same mechanism would hold whereby that should induce accountability? Because I would think that if you have a dominant party in an electoral authoritarian regime that it has already kind of established its dominance through its organizational capacity or other means, repression or what have you, that expanding its revenue and it might result in more service provision, but it might also result in kind of an entrenchment, re-entrenchment of the ruling party's hegemony. So would you say the argument, do you think of the argument is applying more to kind of new democracies that are really more liberal democracies, even if they're poor, than electoral autocracies, or would you extend the argument across regime types?
Yeah, really good question. I find myself at risk of sounding like a modernization theorist, right, in my answer, in version of my answer to you, which is I think we don't have enough of a long run for any electoral authoritarian system to know how long they can last before citizens, even if they're happy with the state of their roads and schools, begin to demand other kinds of representation that lead to democracy coming, right? But when I think about it, I think to myself, if I were to bet on, if I could flip any one country who's currently not democratic, right, into democracy, which one do I think this might actually work in, right? High on my list would be China, right? In part because what the Chinese state has done is develop a very elaborate bureaucratic structure that is able to actually run the country. And so that if there was a leader, and the if is worth pushing me on, right? Because there's an exogenous shock to the system in which the election happens. But if China were to be democratic, my guess is they could make a run at it in a way that I think I'd be far more pessimistic about North Korea making the same run, right? The other is, if you think of the Gulf states, we did these sort of simulation exercises in the book of basically for each of the characteristics taking the different regions of the world and saying, if you run our model through these, where would we see the biggest prospects of democracy? The Gulf states of the Middle East, right? Think of the United Arab Emirates or Qatar or whatever. Actually, if they were to become democratic, would have a very high prospect for surviving as democracies. They have national unity, they're unified, they're very functional states, they've got lots of resources, etc. What I think the big question that we are grappling with, that I'm grappling with over here, and if you have a good way of thinking about it, I'd love to hear more about it, is I don't know that we have any useful models of how long it takes to build a democracy, right? So I kind of said something about this again over lunch, but let me say it again for everyone, is that we make a big mistake, I think, in this entire field when we think about successful democracies and successful democratization efforts. We find examples that, like the United States or the United Kingdom, right? I mean, in grad school, I too read, Weingast and Shepsley and the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and all of that. But none of the modes of democratization available to the early democratizers are on the table today, right? There is not a successful democratization example from that era that doesn't start with limited franchise, right? With populations a heck of a lot smaller than anything over here. So this is almost a scale issue. India's got 1.2 billion people, give or take a couple of 100 million, right? I mean, what is the system, what models are useful for thinking about that democratization effort? And how long is it going to take for this all to sort of gel and all of that? So I worry a lot about sort of a rush, as we've talked, I've been working on this book or this project for the better part of a decade at this point. And I'm equally frustrated by it, of basically saying, how long do we need this entire system to play, right, before we'd actually know whether it's working or not? And there is no benchmark against which we could put that, the countries, even the Latin American countries that have successfully made transitions to democracy today, on average, have been independent nations for about 120 years longer than any of the sub-Saharan African countries have been around today. Right? I mean, there's very little. So I would sort of really say that maybe one way to think about this, from my perspective, is we have to say that the countries facing democratization challenges today are doing so in an environment that we have no real experience in navigating, and we have to be open to this notion that what they might have to do looks very different from what others did, because they're navigating a very different water.
I'm sorry to have to bring it to a close, but on that note, would you please join me in thanking Irfan for a wonderful talk and a great discussion.
Thank you all.